Pues muy bienvenidos a esta serie de actividades que tenemos con el programa de estudios sobre América del Norte. En esta ocasión nos da muchísimo gusto poder recibir a tres viejos conocidos, más conocidos que viejos quizá, pero nos da muchísimo gusto poder contar con tres académicos que nos han apoyado mucho en los procesos de internacionalización de la Universidad Veracruzana a través del programa Fulbright. Le damos la al doctor Barclay Key, desde Little Rock, Arkansas. Él fue nuestro primer profesor Fulbright visitante. Barclay, hi, how are you? Thank you very much for being here this afternoon with us. Thank you so much for joining us from Little Rock, Arkansas, to discuss new ideas with this fantastic panel. So much, thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And as I said earlier, my family and I miss Jalapa very much. And we have very fond memories of our time there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Barclay. And also we have Emma Bailey, when she arrived from New Mexico, a scholar, and now proudly she's a member of the Universidad Veracruzana. She has been working very hard in the graduate program. Emma, muchísimas gracias por estar con nosotros. Te conectas desde Los Sauces, Jalapa. Gracias por estar con nosotros y gracias por acompañarnos en este panel que también reúne pues, esta experiencia Fulbright que ha nutrido mucho a la Universidad Veracruzana en los últimos años.
Muchísimas gracias.
Y last but not least, Dr. Thomas Hayes, de la Universidad de Connecticut, se está reportando con nosotros esta tarde desde la Universidad desde Connecticut, desde su casa, y mucho Thomas. Thank you very much, Thomas, for being today with us. It was a great pleasure to have you last year with us. Last time you were here in November, we had a seminar, and you were here at the conference, and join us this afternoon to discuss the current situation that is going on in the world, in the US, and also Mexico. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you very much for having me. Gracias.
So this conference of this panel is going to be in English. So I'm going to give each one of you a couple of minutes to discuss to join this panel. We are during a crisis. We are dealing with this crisis, with this pandemic that started in March in the case of the US and Mexico. So I would like to know a little bit about how are we dealing as countries, as nations, as neighbors, the situation with the pandemics, but also what have you been observing during this time in terms of how the nations are dealing, the societies and the people are dealing with these pandemics? Most of the people has been staying at home, as in the US and in Mexico, but our current leaders has been sending bad signals, I would say. But also we have elections in November, and we have been witness of a new social movement that has been growing up in the last few weeks with the Black Lives Matter movement and with the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. So what are we seeing in the case of the current situation in the United States? Barclay.
Okay, is my volume working okay?
Yes.
Great. So I thought I would start by mentioning several factors that are happening at once, and I get to go first, so everything I say will be new and put all the pressure on my colleagues. But I think it's important to remember that several factors have converged at the same time in the US. So as you said, the first is the pandemic. And many people are disappointed and appalled at the federal government's response to the pandemic. And that's been doubly true in a state like Arkansas, because the governor has echoed what President Trump says. And there's been a lot of disinformation, supplies have not been quick in arriving. And so the pandemic has not gone well in the US, but right now, especially in Arkansas, our cases are going up by nearly 1,000 per day. So it's the worst that it's been right now. So we have been on lockdown for 3 months, and many people are coming out of lockdown. The governor says that we're opening, but at the same time, statistically, our numbers are getting worse. And we also don't have the usual distractions. So there have been no trips to the mall, few professional sports to watch on television. College students finished their semesters, most of them in mid-May. And so the jobs or the internships that they might have are not available. And so the convergence of those things are important as well. Unemployment remains high for the United States. And then, as Professor Romero mentioned, the police brutality. So police brutality is not new, but it's getting filmed, it's getting spread on social media. And so more people are spending time on social media. Situations like George Floyd occur and people find out about them instantly. And it's also true that President Trump is not popular. His approval rating is currently about 41% and going down. And so I think these three factors are important. The pandemic is happening, unemployment, the economic crisis that's unfolding, and then also the president, the person who's supposed to be the leader, is not popular. He doesn't offer words of encouragement, and in fact, his words often have the opposite effect. And so these three things are national in scope, but I want to focus for a few minutes on local issues, because one thing that is important about the Black Lives Matter movement, in my experience and based on my observation, is that the protests that spread were sparked by George Floyd, but many of them have local contexts. So here in Little Rock, Arkansas, protests have been unfolding. There have been 2 or 3 per day, but people mention George Floyd, but they also mention a man named Bradley Berkshire. He was killed about a year ago in Little Rock by police, and it was all on video. The policeman was immediately fired, but a few months ago he was reinstated. A judge ruled that he had to be reinstated. And so in Little Rock, there's a focus on these local stories, and I think that's been true across the country. I've tried to watch in different places, but George Floyd was the spark, but this is a national problem. It's national in scope, and many local protests have focused on local people. And it's also true that the protests in DC, they get a lot of headlines, but there are always protests in Washington, DC. You can go any day and there will be a protest of some kind. These have been much larger, of course, but I think it's important to realize the scale and the scope of these particular protests. They're much more wide scale. Every state in the United States has seen protests. My hometown in Alabama, population 3,000 people, had a protest last Saturday for Black Lives Matter. And so I think that's what's really new and almost unprecedented about these particular protests. I also want to mention a little bit, speaking of my region of the country, about the protesters who have targeted statues, and your students and viewers might be interested in this. So in the South, in my part of the country, people have long complained about Confederate monuments. I've been complaining about them for 20 years, but most of these monuments were built between 1900 and 1920, decades after the Civil War. But they were erected during a time when laws reinforcing white supremacy were being written. And they were erected in a sense to celebrate and to cement white supremacy and to honor those people who fought against the United States, who fought for the Confederate States of America. And so most courthouses, many libraries, public property often has a Confederate monument. And there is a particular organization called United Daughters of the Confederacy that was responsible for constructing many of them. A historian named Karen Cox is an expert. You should look her up and read her stuff or see her on TV sometimes. But she explains how the United Daughters of the Confederacy also put Confederate flags in many schools. They wrote textbooks for students to use. And so generations of Americans, especially in the South, have grown up with this Confederate propaganda. But young people who have gone to school more recently tend to see those monuments as representative of white supremacy. And so in a moment when Black Lives Matter is the mantra, those statues become targets. And so in many cities, they have been vandalized or even torn down. And to some extent, you see this in other parts of the country. I believe Minneapolis and Boston tore down statues of Christopher Columbus because he's viewed as an invader or a colonialist. And so the reasons are similar, but I think it's especially fascinating in the Deep South because the Confederacy is almost a religion to some people. And so there are intense emotions about these statues. Many state legislatures in just the past few years made it illegal to take those statues down. And so now that young people are attacking them and some cities are taking them down, there's a real tension between state and local governments. One other thing I will mention, and that is the diversity of the current protests is relatively new. Another historian named Tom Segru had an article in the Washington Post last week where he said the diversity of this year's protest points to the reality that during a deep recession, in the midst of a pandemic, everyone is a potential agitator. So the protests that I've personally witnessed have been very diverse. A lot of Black people, a lot of white people. There have been diverse ages. And in the past, especially 50 years ago, that was not necessarily true. And so these protests are different because of that diversity. I think that's almost 8 minutes. I look forward to the conversation though. I especially want to hear what Professor Hayes says about politics. There's a new poll that came out in Arkansas today that says Trump and Biden are close to being tied. So I look forward to hearing my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barkley. Thank you so much for your first thoughts. I guess there's a lot we can discuss around the table about the issues that you have mentioned. I would like to give the table now to Professor Emma Bailey. Emma?
Thank you. Thanks so much for providing this opportunity for us, as well as for other folks who are joining us. And it's really great to see everyone. So I want to approach this from my academic perspective as a sociologist, and in particular, my specialty of social inequality and issues pertaining to things like gender inequality, sexual inequality, and racial inequality, and kind of look at what has been going on for the last 3 months and what's culminated most recently. So one of the things that I wanted to think about out loud with you all is a question that a student asked me a couple of weeks ago, and he was primarily asking me about what was happening in the US and what were the administration's response. And he said, how is it that most of the countries in the world are not addressing, in particular, the COVID-19 pandemic as a health issue, and why has it become a political issue, or why did it become a political issue, and continue in that realm. And so as I've been thinking about that, one of the things that really strikes me is that as a globe, we haven't really had a coordinated approach to the pandemic. So the United Nations has tried various things to kind of bring the world leaders together, but that hasn't been very effective. So that's one of the things that I keep thinking about. But then the other is the response rate and the success of a response. And so there's been a few studies recently. Obviously, as time progresses, we'll know a whole lot more. But right now, certainly one of the things that we're thinking about is what's the impact of inequality? Obviously, first on the pandemic, but what does that degree of inequality mean for responses? And so obviously one of the things to look at is what inequality existed before the pandemic emerged. And so here in Mexico, one of the things that rightfully so needs to be indicated and studied is the 60% increase of domestic violence calls by women to domestic violence shelters. And so what does that mean for particular states within Mexico, and what does that mean for the federal government here in Mexico? And the rate of murders. Since February 28th, there's been 367 women, more or less, murdered here in Mexico. The LGBT community in the United States has definitely felt a bigger brunt of the pandemic in terms of job loss, et cetera, right? And so when we think about these two populations who begin in a place of inequality, that the pandemic itself, right, really launches that forward, really accelerates some of that experience of inequality. And then we bring ourselves to the current moment in the United States, and that is what's going on with Black Lives Matter, and how is that dovetailing what's happening with the pandemic. And of course, it isn't only the historical racism that the communities of color have experienced, but then what has the pandemic itself done within these communities? And so there's some statistics that are pretty stark in terms of within the Black community, that 1 in 1,625 Black Americans have died from the COVID-19, and within the white population, it's 1 in 3,800. So it's a very different dynamic that's been affecting people of color. Another way that we could look at that is the Black population, more or less. Obviously, we'll know more after the census. The Black population in the US represents around 12%, 12.5% of the overall US population, but they have experienced 24%, more or less, of the known COVID-19 deaths at this point. And then if we look at sort of the converse of that, white Americans at this point represent about 62% of the US population, but have experienced only 51% of the COVID-19 deaths. So there's some real inequality happening in terms of effects on communities, and the response, obviously, of the systems of health, the systems of the economic systems, the federal government, et cetera. And so those are sort of some of the underlying things that are happening. And so when you put on top of that some of the things that Barclay already mentioned, right? That when you have the Black Lives Matter reemerging, part of what needs to be remembered is that at least the hashtag itself was born in 2013. So this is nothing new. And the first real Black Lives Matter protest happened in 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri, right? So we have some real history here. So 6 years have passed. Part of what was gained during the Obama administration, mostly after those Ferguson demonstrations and protests, was largely lost in the Trump administration in terms of the demands regarding police brutality, regarding sort of what was permissible and what wasn't, and how is the federal government going to protect and step in and help that. And so with that rollback, of course, some of the newest brutalities have occurred. As was mentioned, a lot of it is captured now on video. Lots of it isn't. There's about 250 deaths per year of Black Americans within police custody. Very few of those police officers are arrested. There's also stark numbers against other communities of color as well. It's not just the Black community, but this is certainly where the spotlight is. And so one of the big things I would say that we see differently now, and I think all of the factors that were mentioned bring us to seeing a much more diverse population, but we also know that people have time to protest because they're out of work or because they're having to stay at home. But we also see, if we think about what are those numbers or how do those numbers have affected the Black community, one of the ways to kind of read this is to say, what else do I have to lose, right? If my community has already lost so much, what else do I have to lose at this moment? And one of the shifts I would say that has occurred is in 2014, it was really a cry to say, hey, look, this police brutality, this police killing is happening, and to actually try and convince people that it was happening. And I think one of the biggest differences this time around is that that isn't the conversation. It isn't about proving or trying to get people to believe that police killings and police brutality exist. It's rather asking that question, now that we know about it, what are we gonna do? How are we going to bring this to a stop? And I think also one of the things that Barclay mentioned that's incredibly important to note is that the Black Lives Matter movement have movements within a variety of communities across the United States, and local communities respond as they wish, right? And so as a sociologist, from the point of history, et cetera, and social movements, this is gonna be incredibly interesting to watch play out. Not only the diversity that we see at the protests, but also how, as a movement, it actually works. So we don't have a coordinated leadership, rather we have pods or localized groups that all are sort of under the same umbrella. And that we also must remember that the demand for the bringing down of the police or the abolishment of the police, the part that isn't necessarily being captured is, what are we going to do with all that money? And so part of then the response is, what I would suggest is actually doing what the government couldn't do or didn't do, which was try to equalize some of the inequality, right? So part of the conversation is, if we defund police, what are we going to do with that sort of bloated amount of money that the police have been receiving? And the idea is, oh, we could actually put it into the Black communities and the services that aren't currently in existence. So I think that's another shift that we see most recently. So I'll leave it at that, and look forward to questions and further conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma, for the ideas that you bring to the table. And yes, there's a lot of issues around what's going on and the roots of it, and especially the consequences of it. So I guess the perspective that we can perceive from these movements are quite important. So now I'm going to give the table to Thomas. Thomas, please.
Well, thank you very much. Those are two very difficult acts to follow. I want to echo a lot of what my fellow panelists have said. I think that we're seeing large-scale changes in American society, politically, economically, socially, culturally. And in some ways, we shouldn't be that surprised that big changes would follow such a big event like this. If we look throughout history, oftentimes we see this is the time in which things start to change after world wars or great depressions or recessions or after pandemics. People start to question the previous systems and the previous ways of doing things, and they start to think about what led us down this path and how can we kind of create a better world. And so I think that one of the things that the pandemic has showed, to echo Emma's points, is that it's really laying bare these vast inequalities many societies, but particularly in the United States. The rates of coronavirus are much higher among non-white populations. They're much higher where there's a higher concentration of poverty, where there's a higher degree of economic inequality. Where we see kind of poor minority people living, we see just higher rates of contact. People whose jobs are seen as essential now are much less likely to be able to kind of work from home, and that tends to fall disproportionately on poor individuals. The stock market is way up. It's not a good measure of how the economy is doing. I think it's a better measure of how the wealthy are doing. The very uber wealthy have gotten much richer off of this pandemic, whereas everybody else is really living paycheck to paycheck, very worried about what's going to come next. Jeff Bezos, for example, has gained an additional $25 billion with a B, billion dollars. Right now, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Warren Buffett have as much money as the bottom half of Americans. So it's really striking how much they have. I also think that the pandemic is showing us that it's something we've seen for a long time, that there's a real struggle in the United States right now, I think, between democracy and authoritarianism. Pandemics and these crises have a way of showing good leadership from bad leadership. And the countries that have responded well to the virus and have treated it as a public health crisis are countries that are much more responsive to their citizens and to public opinion. One of the things I talked about a lot when I was in Jalapa explaining the American system is that our system is not very responsive to public opinion. In general, we see upwards of 60, 70, 80% of the population favoring some policy, but we don't see that put into action. And so, we're seeing this struggle between democracy and authoritarianism with the president that has very clear autocratic tendencies. We're seeing this in the state's response, right, with the use of force by the police, which has been very harsh, right? We see all these videos of police violence now that they're just horrible. There's no way to defend these, right? When that officer has his knee on the neck of George Floyd for over 8 minutes, there's just no way to justify that. There's people screaming at those officers standing around them, and they just won't move or they won't give in, really just because they have power. That seemed to be the only reason they wouldn't change. And so it's not surprising then that the response has been large-scale protests when everybody can see these videos. And then the police, almost on cue, who have denied that there's brutality, then exhibit brutality against peaceful protesters and against the media. I've seen someone have put together over 100 instances of police attacking journalists. They're just standing there filming. And we've all seen the many examples of police attacking people that are peaceful. I don't want to spend too much time on everything that's depressing, because I think there is some reason for optimism. These are the largest protests we've seen since the 1960s. They seem to be having an effect, and they seem to be creating change. But what's different now is that, if you ask people in the 1960s what they thought of protests, in general, for much of American history, the way people view protest is negatively. The majority doesn't support it. That's a big change now. We're seeing a vast majority of people are supporting the protesters. The vast majority of people now say that they support the Black Lives Matter movement. 76% of Americans now say that racism and discrimination is a big problem. That's a big increase. 70% say that the anger that the protesters are feeling is justified. We're seeing something I didn't think I would ever see, which is NASCAR has culturally, we see this shift of banning the Confederate flag, right? NASCAR is banning the Confederate flag. We're seeing statues come down, as Barclay mentioned. And this defund the police movement has been successful already. They've already had successes. The Minneapolis Police Department is essentially being disbanded, is going to be rebuilt from the ground up. We've seen a number of very large cities mayors in large cities have talked about changing the funding, shifting it from police to other areas such as health or education or social work or welfare. I think those are all very positive developments. We're seeing a number of cities institute citizen review boards, mandatory body cameras on police. And there's just, in general, a rethinking about the way in which police might be trained or the way that they can do their jobs and what kind of job they should be doing. And I think that that's important because it's highlighted what I don't think most Americans had at least a majority of Americans had seen for a while, for a long time. And yet non-white Americans, I think, have been very familiar with this for a long time, which is that the police, their first resort isn't always to be friendly. It's actually often to be quite aggressive and quite brutal. And now I think you're seeing a lot of white Americans seeing what has been a reality for Black Americans for a long time. But there's also been some policy changes that, maybe it's going to make people ask a little bit more of their government. So a number of governments, including the United States, have basically given people, some amount of money. Canada gave a lot more, but the United States gave about $1,200 to each citizen. So maybe policies like universal basic income will have, more support now. Maybe people will be more supportive of unemployment income, whereas, now a quarter of the workforce is out of work and wouldn't be able to survive without these unemployment benefits. Maybe there's more support for the welfare state. And maybe, there's more support for healthcare. The fact that the Trump administration has cut and tried to change Obamacare and access to healthcare for a number of people, I think now, hopefully that ends the argument that this is clearly not people's fault. Well, what's the difference between a pandemic and not a pandemic when you lose your job and you still need health insurance? And so I think that hopefully people are going to be asking these questions. One final thing that I think is maybe the most positive that Barclay hinted at is that the Republican Party and President Trump is down in the polls almost everywhere. If we look nationally, Biden has a huge lead. Even in traditionally conservative states, Senate races between the Republicans, Democrats, Republicans are tied in areas we didn't think that they would be tied in. So in places like Iowa, for example. Barclay's totally correct in that President Trump is very unpopular. He's one of the most unpopular presidents of the modern era. He's had so many scandals, so much open corruption. He's purposely dividing people with his rhetoric. It's almost as if, if you think of the worst possible thing to say at any given moment, he seems to say it. And so I think that, people don't have those distractions and they are seeing it for what it is. We're still a long way from the election, but I think that there's, on the road to many positive changes. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Yeah, there are so many questions around, and you have mentioned a lot of very important topics. For example, the history of the Black Lives Matters movement, that it's been around for a while, but has been dismissed by this Trump administration. Now we can see like this revival, but you mentioned some specific point here that it's local movement. I mean, each region in the U.S., each city in the U.S. have seen these movements, and now it's widely known, but it has the roots on each city that has seen this brutality against the Black community. Also, you mentioned, and I guess it was Emma, that these pandemics bring a specific period of time for people to protest. Mm-hmm. So there is time to protest. I mean, because people is not engaged doing something else. Maybe and that's what we have seen, and I think Barclay mentioned a little bit. It's about the participation of young people, from students, from higher education students. So in this panorama, and you were mentioned, Thomas, about this decrease of popularity of the US president, what can we expect? I mean, is this movement is going to stop Trump from re-election? Is there enough time from June to November to do a change on the electoral process, on the electoral system? And I open this question to the three of you. It's, what can we expect? Is there enough time before November? I don't know who wants to go first. Emma, please.
There might be too much time.
Oh.
So if the elections were held next week, I would be completely and utterly delighted, because I don't know if it's appropriate to say historically or socially, the American public has a very short memory. And so between now and November, so much could happen. And so I feel like there's almost too much time. There's too much opportunity for Biden to falter. He hasn't, at least as of this morning, announced a vice presidential running mate. That's going to play a huge part in what also begins to unfold. So I'm just going to say that there might be just too much time, and if we were holding the elections in July, that I would be far more optimistic than I am with elections in November. But I wait to hear what my colleagues have to say.
Okay, Thomas?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true that there's a lot of time still until the election. But, you know, one thing I'll say is that there's decades of research in political science show that incumbents tend to be held responsible for bad economic conditions. That's one of the, you know, most consistent findings. And I think it's hard for me to see the economy just changing so quickly, especially when the public health crisis has not been solved, and the president, frankly, doesn't seem to have the attention span or even the desire to see it solved. And so, you know, there's also some research that's a little bit controversial, but they also find that incumbents are held responsible for things that may even be out of their control, but that are just kind of bad things that happen. So like shark attacks in New Jersey, I think in the 1920s or something. I don't think you can blame the governor for that, but we see that they receive less support than maybe they otherwise would have. So I just think when things are going bad in general, people are more likely to vote against whatever party's in power. And I think that's really bad news for Trump and the Republicans. But again, he's not a normal, typical president. He's really just, since the day he took office, been the most unpopular, you know, president that we've seen. Now, having said that, our system, you don't necessarily have to be popular, and you don't necessarily even need the most votes to win. So it's certainly possible that things could change.
Thank you, Thomas. Barkley?
Yeah, I generally agree with my colleagues. My heart says I wish we could have the election next week, but I know that Thomas is also correct in that I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that no president in the last 50 years has recovered from numbers this low at this point, and win in November. And so, so if I had to place a bet right now, I would say that Trump loses. One thing that wasn't mentioned, though, that I'm sure that we all have this concern, is that the elections are fair. So Georgia, for example, I think it was last week, if you followed the news, in previous years, they closed numerous voting locations. And so during the most recent election, some people, particularly poor people, particularly people of color, had to wait in line literally for hours and hours and hours to get to vote. And so, especially during a pandemic, you see many people calling for mail-in ballots, for an extended voting period, for more creative ways to cast votes rather than just one day or maybe 1 week. And so my personal concern is that the elections be fair in November.
Okay, okay, thank you. So if this election changed the political panorama of the U.S., this means also it's important for foreign nation as Mexico. So we have seen that as is important for domestic policies in the U.S., what the president says or do, as we have seen, it's also important for the role of the U.S. in the world. And what we have seen in the last 2 years is the loss of engagement to the rest of the world. I mean, the way that he have seen his role with the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, with the UN, and suddenly it's an isolation process that the US has been doing in the last 2 years. So during this pandemic, I mean, what can we say about the role of the US in the world? I mean, we have seen new actors as China, for example, or European Union, or maybe Russia, that have been doing bigger steps than the US in the world. And maybe that's also important for the perception that we have seen from the US. I don't know who wants to discuss a little bit about this. Oh, Barclay, please. Your microphone, Barclay.
Sorry. If Biden wins, I think that he will begin rebuilding those relationships. But right now, they're in tatters. The Secretary of State, Pompeo, has not filled many positions. There are many positions within the State Department that have not been filled. And so there's no one with whom to speak if I'm in another country and need to speak to an American representative. And it seems that Trump and Pompeo have done a lot to undermine many of those relationships. So my hope would be that if Biden were elected, his choice of Secretary of State would be important, but also it will take time to rebuild those relationships, and it will not happen in one term. I would see this taking, a decade or more to give our friends around the world time enough to trust the United States again. And maybe as a corollary to that, it will be interesting to see which direction the Republican Party goes, because right now the Republican Party is Donald Trump, but there are a handful of Republicans who are more internationalist. And I'll be curious to see if that segment of the party is able to take control, or if the party dissolves into something else.
Okay, Thomas?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd say, our relations with Russia, Saudi Arabia, and North Korea have never been stronger. But other than that, I think that if you look at public opinion surveys, people in other countries have a very low view of the United States. That tends to happen when there's Republican administrations, but it's much more pronounced during the Trump administration. The governments in other countries and these other, Western democracies have been pretty open, especially during the pandemic, that they're not really talking that closely with the Trump administration. They don't even really take them that seriously anymore. I just saw a poll, I think it was a Gallup poll yesterday, that asked Americans, are they proud to be Americans? And that's gone down a lot too, which I found particularly surprising, that generally Americans are very proud, USA, right? We hear this chant. But we see these opinion polls showing much less support, this idea that, you're proud to be an American. I think a lot of people feel a lot of shame of the president. I felt like when I was in Jalapa, a lot of, the lectures I would give, I would start by apologizing for how terrible our government is. And so, you know, I think that we've seen this in a number of ways. Just recently, you may have seen this clip where they asked the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, what do you think of, you know, the president's response to these protesters? And he couldn't respond for about a minute and a half because he really had to think about what he wanted to say, because it's just been awful. You know, clearing protesters for a photo op is unbelievable. But you know, nothing is unbelievable in the Trump administration, I think. So I agree with my fellow panelists. I think it's going to take a long time to repair relations with other countries, and that would, I think, start with a democratic administration.
Okay, Emma?
I think I absolutely agree with what's been said. I think the other thing that I would add is that people in other countries understand way more about what's happening in the US than we do in the US about what's happening in other countries. And part of what that then means is that individual folks are not held responsible. Individual US citizens are not held responsible for what the administration does or is doing. And so they have this understanding, maybe it's from their historical perspective, their place in the world, et cetera, but they understand or have a long-term view of how things are rather than sort of an instantaneous perspective. And so, for instance, here in Mexico, I've not met one person who has held me responsible for the Trump administration or the fact that Trump is in office. And I would say the same about my family, who or very few of whom live in the United States and other countries. They certainly have a much longer view and understand that what's currently happening isn't the norm, and that there isn't any reason that relationships could not be repaired. So I think, though, one of the things I would say, kind of dovetail with what Thomas said, that is kind of disturbing, is what the U.S. or the current administration has I don't know, allowed is the correct verb, but certainly has assisted in the rise of power of North Korea, Russia, right, et cetera. And so that's one of the things then, in terms of global relations, what does that then mean with a new administration, as it might unfold, right, to have these other political powers that we hadn't seen before sort of having presence on the world stage. So I think those are some of the things I think about anyway.
Thank you, Emma. So now we're going to open the discussion to the rest of the participants that are here joining us today. There is one question, and I will read it, and if you want to answer. If Joe Biden becomes president, how would be his relationship with President López Obrador? I mean, there has been a lot of questioning here in Mexico about how the president of Mexico should behave in front of the US president. So sometimes it says that it's better to have a Democrat or a Republican on office in terms of the good relationship with Mexico. But if Trump is not there and Joe Biden is there, what can we expect in terms of the relationship with Mexico? I would like to clarify that the spokesman for the U.S. presidency has been the son-in-law of Trump. I mean, he's not a public officer, but he has been the link between the U.S.-Mexico relationship. So what can we expect with Biden? I don't know who wants to. ¿Alguien que quiera empezar? Thomas?
I'll start. I mean, it's always difficult to know kind of what's going to happen in the future, but I think, you know, in general, at least in terms of policy to immigration to migration, you're going to see a big difference. And that's not to say that Democrats and Republicans have always been that different. Over the past 20, 30 years, we've seen even Democratic presidents, you know, deport. Obama deported a record number of people, right? So, but what I think is different now is that you know, the Democratic Party, the kind of leaders in the Democratic Party in that coalition tend to be younger people, tend to be progressives, and that's who's really pushing the party right now, I think. And so I think especially on immigration policy, you know, the Trump administration has been pretty clear about, you know, building a wall and really stopping migration, legal and you know, undocumented immigration. And I think that you're going to see a big change with the Democratic administration.
Okay. There are another questions. Invitamos a la gente quien tenga preguntas también puede levantar la mano o escribirlas. Tenemos otra pregunta. We have another question from Professor Carlos Garrido. He's asking about can we justify the social protests, even the violence that comes with some social protests, or we should wait for the elections to protest? I mean, what is the role of the society and also the universities during this period of time? I mean, what should we wait for the election, or should we be protesting? Emma?
So I want to thank you for that question, because that's certainly something that lots of people are talking about, particularly the question about what is viewed in the riot as destruction of property. And so I think that the most important thing for us to consider is, if we're questioning the destruction of property, we're probably standing from a very privileged place to even ask that question. So that's one thing I would say. And the other thing I would say is that if we are putting private property above people's lives, then we probably have some values that need to be reevaluated in the United States. So those are two just kind of the way to kind of frame and think about that question, right? Secondly, I think that one of the things that has often gotten lost in the United States is this idea that voting is the way that we participate in a democracy. And there are many ways to participate in a democracy. And it is, you know, protected for us to speak and to protest. And as was mentioned earlier, I think Thomas mentioned this earlier, is that in the United States, public opinion has rarely mattered. And so even when we vote for something or for someone, we don't necessarily see action from that individual or from those decisions, right? So I think for me, one of the most important things is to see that people are taking their democratic participation seriously. And it is, again, as we mentioned, a very wide spread of people, very diverse groups of people in very different locales, from communities of 3,000 to major cities like New York, et cetera. And so to me, that's all heartening. I mean, absolutely all heartening. And if again, right, if we see a riot as somehow being destructive, then we probably haven't experienced that which is being protested against. And so we need to kind of take a step back and go, wait a minute, if I'm asking that question, or if I'm thinking about the destruction of public or private goods over the principles that are being protested, then probably I'm speaking from a place, from a position in society where I haven't experienced that which the protesters are experiencing.
Okay, someone else? Barclay, please.
I could not help but notice that in Minneapolis, at least, the policemen responsible for murdering George Floyd were not arrested until there had been several days of property destruction. And so in general, I don't necessarily advocate property destruction, but I texted one of my friends, and after they were arrested, I said, well, riots work. And I don't say that flippantly. there are times that you get people's attention by doing something destructive. But peaceful protests have been the norm. And so in addition to what Emma said, I would add that thousands and thousands and thousands of people have been protesting peacefully. And I think those overwhelming numbers have given the people with political power pause, right? It's not just the destruction of property. It's also these vast numbers of people, not just African American communities, who have been participating in these protests. But part of me also thinks, well, you can threaten these political powers all day, but at the end of the day, you got to vote for the alternative, whatever that alternative may be. I think the problem has often been that the Democrat and Republican parties have not always provided stark alternatives. But in this particular election year, in national elections, I think the difference is probably greater than it's been in my lifetime.
Okay. Thomas?
I think it's a good question. I think it's something that's been talked a lot about in the media. I think that in response, I'd say, and I've heard a lot of protesters say this, a lot of Black protesters said, well, we've tried everything. We've tried voting. We've tried being peaceful. We tried kneeling as a form of protest, and that was met with utter contempt. And so you can understand the total frustration that they're going to have when they've tried kind of every means to raise awareness, and it's kind of met with the response that it's met with. And even before these protests happened and a few of the riots happened, there was a protest in Michigan in which people went into the state government and they shut down the legislative proceedings with assault rifles, and they had guns out in the open. The police responded very restrained. They didn't beat anybody up. There was really no police violence with that. So I think the difference in response by the police is really stark. So the question of should we wait? I think no. I think politicians, elected officials need to be pushed, and that's how change happens. Large-scale social movements can often be successful, and they've done a really good job, I think, at trying to keep them peaceful. I think that the instances of the riots and the fires, right, those get on the screens and those become very apparent in our minds, but the vast majority of these protests have been very much peaceful. Most of the violence has come from the state, not from the people.
Okay, thank you. We have another two questions. One is from Mario Oliva. Mario Oliva sent his regards to each one of you. And also he's asking about, can we think that is a new Cold War coming? I mean, there has been a lot of excitement between China and the US, and even the new NAFTA. It's about closing the door to China to come to America for trade. So is there a new kind of Cold War that is coming maybe? And also, and I would like to add another question that it's our colleague Veronica is asking. This means that the US is losing their leading position in the economic system. So I don't know who wants to start with these two questions. Barclay, yes?
I want to say I don't know. My sense is that the Democrats are much more internationalist and would be much more likely to establish more normal relations with China. But I do think the pandemic has complicated those relations a lot. So even if a Democrat were in power right now, I think the pandemic has put a lot of countries on lockdown. and we don't know what coming out of lockdown might look like. And so I think fleshing that out is going to be important. And it's important to bring in outside parties like the UN and WHO. So I'll be curious to see if Democrats take that approach. But I don't have a good sense, honestly, of how things might evolve. Maybe my colleagues will.
Okay, thank you. And who wants to go next?
I'll just add that I also don't know. You know, it's a tough question. I think that, you know, if we see, you know, Donald Trump reelected, or I think we could also see just in the campaign, a lot of Republicans, they've already tried to do this in some way to blame China. It's China's fault. They try and call it the Wuhan virus, the Chinese virus. And so I think, you know, as a way to kind of distract from their own mishandling of the pandemic, they would like to place blame on China. You know, whether that leads to kind of a new Cold War, I think depends on the party in power and the goals that they have. I think you could see maybe something like that with the Republican administration. I think I agree with Barclay that if it's a Democratic administration, they're probably going to want to have closer ties with most nations, and including China.
Okay. So I don't know if you have, Emma, some comments about it, or maybe we can move. There are a few other questions too. Okay. So this is a question from Aranza Su. She's asking about your perspective about how to analyze the use of reverse racism in order to dilute the Black Lives Matters movement, using the false concept to put people in each other, or divide each other. All right. Yes, Emma.
So I think kind of what's already been mentioned in regards to the divisive comments that are coming out of the current administration, the current White House, certainly lend themselves to that, to aiding that sort of language. But I think, as has been mentioned, the overwhelming numbers that we're seeing in protests, the fact that we're over the conversation about whether this is happening to what are we going to do about it, has really muted, for the first time, some of that language of reverse racism, and that this idea that somehow if we actually practice, right, civil rights for all groups, that somehow white Americans are going to miss out on that, is sort of the basic principle of that, right? I think that we're actually at a very different place as a society than we have been before, and that it's very hard to not see things for what they really are, and I think the pandemic has helped that in so many ways, because our attention isn't on a million and one other things. We're not at work. We're not watching professional sports and all that sort of stuff. So I think for the first time, I'm actually very optimistic about moving forward in the racial conversation and having a real conversation about systemic racism. And I think that one of the other things that we are seeing is all different levels of people joining that conversation, from television stars, movie celebrities, understanding and holding space for that conversation. And so I don't think that when that's being brought up, I think that people understand it's linked to the current administration. I think they understand the link to US history, and it's not going to hold water like it has in the past.
Okay, so Barclay, please.
I agree with what Emma said, but I would also add that, or just reiterate the fact that this phrase Black Lives Matter, from when it was first used in 2013, 2014, was viewed hypercritically by the majority of Americans. And then in the span of what, 2 or 3 weeks, it's the most popular phrase in the country. And you have political leaders on the right, like Mitt Romney, marching and saying Black Lives Matter. And so I just, for our viewers, I just want to reiterate what a huge dramatic change that is in the span of a very short amount of time. And so like Emma, I haven't heard a lot of that same talk about reverse racism as I would have in the past. I'm sure it's still there. I'm sure it'll arise again, but it hasn't been as evident, at least in the last few weeks.
Okay, Thomas?
One thing that I'll certainly echo what my panelists said, but one thing that I'll add that I think Aranzazu might be asking about is, the potential for like a backlash, opinion backlash, or maybe even a policy backlash against kind of the changes that happen. I've done a little bit of research on this, looking at the movement of gay rights in the United States, because there was kind of the same thing, that it started to change very quickly. Public opinion started to change very quickly, and people had often said, there might be a backlash, this might set back the movement. We looked at this almost any way that we could, all sorts of opinion polls and experiments and surveys, and we found no evidence that there's these opinion backlashes. I think oftentimes that threat is used by people that don't want to see change happen, and it kind of gets spread, and then people kind of take on that fear of, well, we can't push too hard, too fast. When I think that, the movement of gay rights very recently shows it was one of the fastest changes that we've seen, kind of once the issue really started to get going. And opinion change I think the evidence of no backlash is in public opinion, that, vast majority of people now are supportive of gay marriage, of gay rights, of equality. Just today, the Supreme Court issued a ruling, protection for people in their jobs for same-sex individuals. And so, I think that examples like this show us that exactly what Emma's saying, that it's a different time in the United States, and I think it's a very positive, could be very positive.
Okay, there are more questions. There's one from Vilma here. With all this turmoil going on in the U.S., can you see any effects on Mexico? I mean, in terms of the economic crisis and the social movement in the U.S., can we any kind of consequence in the relationship with Mexico, or even in Mexico? I mean, historically, the movements coming from the U.S. has been has had some replication in the past. So, can we expect something like this in Mexico too?
I don't know. Would be one of the answers, but I think something that's interesting to note is the recent demonstrations against police brutality here in Mexico that may or may not have made it in the news, broadly speaking, in the U.S. So in that respect, there may be momentum in terms of what you mentioned, Daniel, and in the ability for people to stand up in ways that they hadn't, sort of echoing what's happening in the United States. Whether that will play out in terms of it being the conversation around race and racial inequality here in Mexico being part of that conversation, I don't know. I kind of have to see what happens. I think that immigration scholars here in Mexico as well as in the U.S. are going to be interested to look at is the overall toll on Mexico for the lack of the ability for people to migrate into the United States, or those folks who have been detained along the Mexican-U.S. border in Mexico. So I think that there are definitely some long-term effects that we just can't understand right now in terms of economic burden that Mexico has had to play has had to take on as a result of the U.S. policies right now in regards to immigration. So I think that will be something interesting to study. So what does that mean? And one of the hopes that I have is that, like I mentioned in the beginning of my remarks, to have a coordinated effort. That definitely the impact that people of color in the U.S. are feeling, certainly women in Mexico are feeling and have been feeling. Is there a way for the U.S. to respond to that and to actually support the women's rights movement here in Mexico, and to bring not only national attention, but perhaps even international attention to what's happening and has been happening, but has been accelerated during the last several months here in Mexico as regards to violence against women. So.
Okay. Someone else would like to, Berkeley? Yes.
I don't have a good answer either, but I'll be curious to know if students in Mexico and students in the United States strengthen their ties and network and perhaps find solidarity together in some of these protests. It seems to me, I attended a protest about a week ago, and I was bringing the average age up. Everyone there was much younger than I. And again, a lot of comparisons have been made to the 1960s, and many of those protests, both civil rights, anti-war protests, feminist protests, many of them were organized and led by young people. And so I'll be curious to see if there's some sort of cross-pollination between Mexico and the United States with these ideas.
Okay, good. Thomas?
I'll just, maybe say one quick thing that, I don't know, but I hope that there are changes in Mexico and really in all countries that, I can't take credit for saying this. I heard this the other week from a professor of political science in the United States, Christian Davenport. He said that, the police, we don't often think about it this way, but police might be the most frequent and constant violators of human rights across the world, just because it just happens every day on kind of a mundane level. That we often think about governments, or we think about military or in times of war, but just because it's so constant every day that police are violating people's human rights. So I really hope that other countries take a look at the way that police have become militarized, and whether that really makes people feel safe. Is that kind of a system working or not? I think we know that it's not the best solution.
Okay, thank you. And there is another question, and this question is coming from Ignacio, that you all remember very well. If the power of these riots will become successful, the result of this riot becomes successful, what are we going to see about in the U.S.? What are the chances for the U.S. if these riots and these protests and this movement are clearly successful? What will we see? Barclay?
I think maybe Emma hinted at this earlier, but if they are successful, completely reimagining how we have public servants police and aid its citizens. On social media, someone posted a day or two ago, there was another man killed in Atlanta, I think it was 2 nights ago, and instead of calling the police, we could have called someone else who was, I don't know what that person would be called, social servant. And he would come check on the man who was clearly having difficulty, but he was not hurting anyone. He was not hurting himself. And that person would help the man get home, help him to get to a safe place, help him to find assistance if he needs food or shelter or whatever. And another thing circulating on social media right now is the vast sums of money that local and state governments spend on police that they do not spend on education, on housing and welfare services. And so I think success would mean reimagining what we think of when we think of police, and putting money behind humans who can help citizens get through life, cope with life, and not show up with guns drawn and be violent and continuing to kill people.
Okay. Emma, yes?
So absolutely everything that Barclay said, I would agree. A number of years ago, I heard a homeless advocate in Portland, Oregon speak. Portland has one of the largest populations of folks without homes. And he said every police officer in Portland needs to know how someone is, how they are, whether upon the first 10 seconds, whether the individual is sleep deprived, whether they might be high on drugs, whether they might be experiencing a mental illness, or in fact, whether they're violent, right? And the police have to be able to, right, determine those things. The police don't have that kind of resource. They've not been trained in those sorts of things at all. In many cities, it's required that they're bilingual police in certain neighborhoods. That hasn't been followed as a rule. So you have people who actually can't respond to what the police are saying because they don't speak English fluently. We have the large number of deaf people who are brutalized and killed by the police because the police don't understand that the individual actually physically can't hear them. And so those are some of just, some of the large scale everyday issues that a police officer responds to. And so I think that we can't ask the police to do all of that. We shouldn't ask the police to do all of that. And because we didn't know what else to do, we just weaponized them and militarized the police in ways unimaginable. In some of the poorest states, Mississippi and New Mexico being two of them, I lived for 15 years in New Mexico, and to see the stark contrast of for instance, the vehicles that the officers drove in comparison to the cost of living in the community, right? Or what the average annual salary was for people living there, right? So driving brand new Dodge Chargers, as a police vehicle, is you're like, where is the 5-lane freeway in New Mexico, rural New Mexico? So all of that money has done two things. It's militarized, weaponized the police, and defunded other programs. And it's asked the police to handle large social issues without any skill, without any training. And that's an impossibility. And so I think that we're for the first time having a real conversation outside of the university classrooms, I might add, about how to begin to level the playing field, how to address systemic racism, and how to undo that. And the police is one start. It is not the only thing that needs to happen, but if we begin to understand that we need to reallocate that money, and that we need to do, as Barclay said, put it into services that aren't present right now in so many poor communities and communities of color, that would be amazing. And even if it just happens in a few places in states rather than perhaps the whole state, those can be programs that we can see as being successful and move forward. And then the next step is federal legislation, right? So with that tag team effort, we've got local, regional, and state policies at work, but then we also need to kind of close the circle and pass some real meaningful federal legislation as well.
Okay. Would you like to add something, Thomas? Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think, certainly to echo what both Emma and Barclay have said, I really hope that there's, success to me would be certainly, implemented via policy, but also I think, more generally, just a reimagined view of how people view the government and what they demand from the government. People should be, we have this ideology in the United States where a number of people, they don't like government, and so they think that maybe the way to the solution to that is to defund a bunch of programs that they don't like the welfare state. But that's really problematic for a number of reasons. But hopefully now in the middle of this crisis, people are more likely to see that there should be an option for government-run healthcare. That the government shouldn't be privately run. That people shouldn't be making money off of your health. That we should have more of a community response and a much more integrated and better response when people are in trouble. Right. The first option shouldn't just be to send in these militarized police. Right. And then, also, I've been hoping for a long time that there's been some other social movements like the Occupy Wall Street movement that have been pushing for this for a long time. But I really hope that people look around and realize that these millionaires and billionaires have gotten so wealthy, even in a time of crisis where, the average person isn't doing any better. And, the way to solve a lot of these policy solutions is just to raise taxes very slightly on this group. And we can have free education, healthcare, right? A lot of things that are very popular among the American public. And taxes on the wealthy are at the kind of the lowest point that we've seen in hundreds of years in the United States. It doesn't take that much more to get a lot of the things that would lead to a better society. So I'm really hoping people reimagine and demand more from their government.
Okay, I think time's up. I mean, we have had a great discussion. I guess there's a lot of questions around, and we can continue for several more hours discussing what's going on, not only in the U.S. but also in the rest of the world, because as you mentioned, these pandemics has bring a new scenario for protests, to think about issues different from our daily needs and daily thoughts. So I guess there's this new scenario will bring a new era, whatever we might call it. We don't know when the post-COVID era is going to begin. I mean, maybe few more months, few more years, we don't know yet. So, but there is something going on. There's a transition to somewhere. We hope that this is going to bring the best of us. And I would like to before we end this great discussion and this great panel, I would like to give you the table to you and for a few final thoughts. And I will start with Barclay, please.
Okay, I'll put a damper on things. I am less optimistic about what the United States does after the pandemic with regard to public health. And one reason is because as a historian, I've been reading about the 1918 flu pandemic for 2 or 3 months now. And of course, it was terrible, deadly, thousands died. And in that moment with the World War and with a pandemic, I suspect that people also felt that big change was about to come. And at least with regard to public health, within 2 or 3 years, changes did not come. People forgot about the pandemic. I mean, obviously, if you lost a loved one, you remembered that loved one, but the general public did not pressure Congress, certainly, to fund research on the influenza virus. And so, at least in that instance, not a lot changed. And so my fear is that this pandemic will, in a few years, will say the same thing. I'm slightly more optimistic that the pressures brought about by the protests will lead to some local changes, at least, like even here in Little Rock, The city's already ordered body cameras. We've already got an outside entity to evaluate our police department, and we've got tons of problems. But those two things were already not happening and were not going to happen until the last few weeks. And so I'm a little more optimistic that maybe we'll make some progress on that account.
Thank you so much, Barclay. Emma?
So one of the things that that I think is the most disappointing for me is that countries have not been working together around the pandemic, and I think that that says a lot about where we are as world nations. And I think that even alongside the Black Lives Matter protests, not only in the United States but in other countries as well, that the other piece that we keep hearing is that we need to open the economy. We need to open the economy. We need to open the economy. And so so we are already, or we are still practicing what we were practicing before we entered the pandemic, which is the economy is first. And so I also am very hopeful about what's happening locally. I'm very happy to see what I would say a dramatic shift in the racial conversation than certainly a year ago, definitely different than in 2013. So those are very, very positive, but I don't see the US shifting its value base sufficiently away from an economy first practice. So that, like Barclay, healthcare is certainly not, I don't see it becoming anything like a European system or the Canadian system. That doesn't mean that I don't hope for it. It doesn't mean that I don't work towards that, but that is one of the toughest pieces. And so as long as we continue to position the economy above health, of public health, and we juxtapose ourselves in the world against other nations in terms of moving the economy forward, then we're not going to be able to have a global sort of response in the future. As many epidemiologists are predicting that this is just the first of many. This isn't the last. So I'm not even very hopeful that the next time around we're going to do a better job of responding, and that what we'll see is those groups that are experiencing social inequality now will continue to experience that in the next round, whether that round be again in the fall and autumn, or whether it be with the new whatever SARS manifestation is going to be.
Gracias, Emma. Thomas, final thoughts?
Well, thanks again for the opportunity to be on the panel. You caught me at a time when I'm maybe at my most optimistic. Had this been 2 weeks ago, or in another week, I don't know. But I'm quite optimistic. I think for a number of reasons that I've maybe already mentioned, but it's worth reiterating. The successes that the protest movement has already had, to me, are signs for optimism. The second is just the kind of public opinion polls. The kind of state of the Republican Party is one that I think it's really important that there be a big defeat of Trumpism, because I think that's really dangerous for a political party to basically adopt authoritarian attitudes. Both parties need to be strong advocates for democracy. And hopefully getting rid of Trumpism and Trump could help maybe the Republican Party move in that direction. Although I'm kind of skeptical. On the kind of front of the pandemic, it certainly worries me, the United States response, or kind of bungled response. And it also worries me that it seems like people are kind of bored of it, and that they are just kind of ready to move on. But the virus isn't going to let us just move on. This is something that everybody needs to take seriously. So. But nevertheless, I'm optimistic. Thanks again for having me on the panel.
Okay, so thank you very much to each one of you. Thank you. It was a pleasure for me to see you again, to talk to you again, to discuss issues that we usually do when we were in front of each other. And hopefully maybe in the near future we will have this panel repeat, but here in Jalapa, in Universidad Veracruzana, you're more than welcome. You're part of the university, and we really enjoy this discussion, and thank you very much for having the time to have this conversation with Universidad Veracruzana. A todos los asistentes les agradecemos mucho la oportunidad de su presencia. Les agradecemos sus preguntas, agradecemos a todos los que nos acompañaron y tuvieron preguntas con nosotros. Este webinario, como todos los que organiza la Dirección General de Relaciones Internacionales y el Programa de Estudios sobre América del Norte, estará disponible en la página de internet de la Universidad Veracruzana en el link de Internacional. Gracias a cada uno de ustedes por estar esta tarde con nosotros. Muchas gracias a todos y les deseamos un excelente inicio de semana en este lunes 15 de junio. Thank you so much, guys. Hope you're fine.
It was an honor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Berkeley. Have fun.